I've been working on this farm for years. Most days pass with the same routine, rising early, tending the fields, and watching the corn grow. That night, for reasons I can't even begin to imagine, everything changed. This is my story. I was finishing my shift in the cornfield. The rows were neat, the air cool, and I was alone under the open sky. While I worked, I caught a glimpse at the edge of my view. There, moving over the corn, was something that looked like a white sheet. The heck? I muttered to myself. It wasn't a piece of cloth caught in the wind. It held a form that made it seem as if it were watching me. I turned my head, expecting to see a stray banner or a discarded rag. But as soon as I looked directly at it, the shape pulled away with a sudden jerk. I nearly fell onto my backside. I was caught so off guard. Initially, I thought I was seeing things. I had been out in the field, and I was somewhat exhausted. The field had its own sounds and movements, and maybe I had misjudged a gust of wind. But the next day, and the day after, I saw that same shape again, always near the edge of my vision, floating over the corn. Sometimes it stayed still, other times it moved in a way that defied normalcy. Every time I tried to get a clear look, it shifted. When I finally focused on it, the shape tore away and vanished. I tried to dismiss it. After all, I had seen many odd things over the years: rusted farm equipment, unexpected animal behavior, even a few unexplained noises at night. But this was different. It wasn't just an object drifting on a breeze. It felt as if it had an intent, as if it was aware of my presence. One night, curiosity outweighed caution. I finished my work, locked up the barn, and stepped out into the dark field. The corn was silent, except for the sound of my own boots on the ground. I recalled the figure from the previous days, and decided to find it. I moved along the rows, keeping my eyes alert, waiting for that white shape to appear. After a while, I saw it again. There, in a gap between the rows, it floated. It looked much like a piece of fabric, billowing in the air. I paused at the edge of the field. The figure did not dart away immediately. It seemed to hover, as if waiting for me. My heart raced as I took a few steps forward. I wasn't sure what I would find, or if I was chasing something that didn't belong to this world. I had to know. I broke into a run. The sound of my footsteps mingled with the rustle of corn as I closed the distance. The white cloth moved slowly, caught in a pattern I could not predict. I followed it toward a cluster of older corn stalks where the field ended and the land began to rise into an open patch. There, the shape hovered for a moment, as if testing my resolve. I reached out with a shaking hand. The moment my fingers brushed it, everything went dark. I cannot say what happened next. In that instant, I remember a sensation of falling, and then nothing at all. When I came to, I was lying on a hard, rough surface. I blinked against a bright light, and realized I was not in my familiar field. I sat up slowly and looked around. I was on the side of a long, deserted road. The corn was gone. The land was barren. A chill ran through me as I tried to piece together the events of that night. I stood and began to walk along the road, confused and disoriented. Hours might have passed as I staggered forward, until a passing truck slowed down beside me. The driver, a middle-aged man in a worn cap, pulled over and offered help. I explained in halting sentences that I had been in my field, and then, I don't know. I told him about a white cloth that had been stalking me, and I sighed heavily. Good Lord, he thinks I'm a Looney Tune. Though he listened, his face unreadable. He helped me into the cab and drove me to a small clinic in a nearby town. At the clinic, I was treated for dehydration and exhaustion. Tests showed nothing unusual. No head injury, no signs of a serious accident. The staff said I must have blacked out and wandered off. I tried to explain what I remembered last, keeping the bit about the sheet quiet. They later told me I was on the missing persons list and had been for the last 6 months. While I remember that night, I had no memory of half a year. What the heck happened to me? Where the heck was I in that time? I was told that I was found on the side of the road, miles from the farm, and that my return was a mystery in itself. Once I recovered, I went back to the farm. I hoped to find an explanation. I retraced my steps along the field, talked to the workers, and even mentioned the white cloth to a few neighbors. They listened politely but offered only tired looks and the suggestion that I had been overtired. No one had seen anything unusual. The cornfield was exactly as it had always been, a field of corn. There was no sign of a drifting sheet or any other disturbance. Over time, I filed reports with local authorities and sought help from doctors who specialized in unexplained memory loss. They ran tests and examined me carefully. The accounts all pointed to a simple blackout, perhaps triggered by exhaustion or a sudden shock, but I know what I saw. I remember the sensation of reaching out in the darkness, the moment when I lost everything. I have no rational explanation for what happened. I have not seen that white cloth again. At work, when I move among the rows of corn, I still catch myself glancing at the edges of my vision, half expecting to see it. The field is calm and ordinary, and yet I cannot shake the memory. I tell my story whenever I can, but each time the reaction is the same, a mix of doubt and concern. They say that stress or lack of sleep can play tricks on the mind, that I might have misinterpreted a piece of cloth caught on a pole or blown by a sudden gust of wind. But the details are too clear in my mind. The way it hovered at the edge of my view, the way it moved when I looked directly. It wasn't a common occurrence on any farm, and it wasn't something that could be easily explained away. I tried to gather any evidence I could, but the night left nothing behind. The cornfield offered no trace of a piece of fabric that could move on its own. I live with that memory now. 6 months of my life are a blank, and the gap in my memory is a constant reminder that something happened that night. I have looked for answers in the books of local legends and the files of medical reports, but nothing fits. The incident remains a mystery, one that I am forced to accept as part of my past. Every day on the farm, I work with the same care I always have. I mow, I plant, I harvest. The routine has become my anchor. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn or after dusk, I remember the white cloth. I recall the feeling of reaching out into the dark and the sudden loss of time. Those memories come unbidden, and I wonder if I will ever know what truly happened. I have spoken of the incident to many, but the response is always the same: disbelief mixed with pity. No one has experienced what I did, and no one can verify my account. The story has become a part of me, a secret that I carry like a burden. In the years since, I have not witnessed anything like it again, and I try not to dwell on the unexplained. I continue my work on the farm, returning each day to the rows of corn that mark the passage of time. I have learned to live with uncertainty, to accept that some questions remain unanswered. The white cloth is a memory that refuses to fade, a reminder that in the midst of a life that seems ordinary, there are moments that defy explanation. I tell myself that I must have touched something beyond my understanding that night. Perhaps it was a trick of the mind, or perhaps I encountered something real that I cannot explain. The truth remains locked away, and I have come to live with the possibility that I may never know the answer. That is my story. I reached out for a white sheet that danced on the wind, only to lose myself and find my life altered in ways I cannot describe. No one believes me now, and I have never seen that thing again. Yet, in the quiet moments on the farm, I sometimes think back to that night and wonder if I missed the chance to understand what it was all about. I arrived at the barn as day gave way to night, my head still fuzzy from the meds I had taken an hour before to combat a bad cold I was going through. Not genuinely a smart idea to mix meds and work, but the show must go on. My family had owned this barn for as long as I can remember, a place for storing tools and old crates. Tonight, I had come to clear out a stack of crates that had long been forgotten. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The barn was silent, except for the sound of my own footsteps and the soft rustle of hay. I'm not sure what triggered it, but something felt off. I can't explain it. I had thought for a moment that I had heard of the faintest of voices, almost like losing an AirPod in the sheets and not being able to find it. For a sanity check, I paused and strained to catch it. A few moments passed by, but there again I heard it, a barely audible plea that seemed to whisper from the walls. I set my rake aside, feeling a chill spread through me. The beam of my lantern fell on the dusty floor and on the neglected crates, casting shifting forms that I tried to dismiss as tricks of the light. Still, the voice grew stronger, more determined to catch my attention. It seemed to call out a single word: help. I stepped away from the crates and followed the sound. I moved toward a corner of the barn I had never given much thought to, with all the old debris from farm life years before. I maneuvered behind a stack of decrepit boxes and equipment where I found a narrow door I don't recall ever seeing. The sound appeared to come from behind it. My hand trembled as I reached for the cold metal handle. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if I should open it, but an unyielding sense of courage and curiosity pushed me onward. Here goes nothing, I thought to myself. Ugh, please don't let these words be my last. I opened the door and was met with a rush of cold air. Beyond lay a narrow corridor lined with items I'd never seen, a few pictures, pieces of furniture, and tools long forgotten. I advanced, my boots echoing on the wooden floor. On the walls, old dilapidated portraits seemed to watch me. Their creepy faces, half-rotten and half-moldy visages, seemed to stare at me, unblinking. It's not a lie to say they made me uneasy. As I reached the corridor's end, the lantern flickered and nearly died. I fumbled with it until the light returned. That's when I saw a figure at the far end. It was hard to make out details, but I knew the form was human. The figure moved at a steady pace, neither in haste nor in ease. Its eyes caught the faint light for an instant, and I felt as though I were staring at something I could not recognize. The figure slowly raised a hand, as if reaching out. My heart pounded, and I froze for a moment. I longed to ask, "Who are you?" But no words emerged. The corridor seemed to stretch on, and the voice that had lured me now merged with an echoing rustle that made my skin crawl. Then, without warning, I tore myself from that paralysis and ran back toward the main part of the barn. I sprinted down the passage, my footsteps loud on the wooden floor. I pushed a heavy crate into the doorway, hoping to block it, and I could hear the heavy steps of someone following me. I did not look back. I concentrated only on escaping that narrow passage and the unknown presence it contained. Bursting into the barn's open space, I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, panting. The low call for help persisted, now muffled, but still present. I gathered myself and picked up my rake again, though every creak of the barn and every shift of the air reminded me of what had happened. What had I just experienced? Was it real? Was it the meds? I'm going delirious, I thought. I need to breathe and focus on what's in front of me. It had to be the meds. What I saw made no sense. I mean, how could it? Nothing was getting me near that door to make that determination, though. For hours, I worked inside that barn, trying to convince myself that my mind had played tricks on me. I sorted crates, repaired tools, and attempted to resume my routine. But the memory of that voice and the figure stuck with me. I kept glancing toward the no longer hidden door, wondering if the call would rise again and force me to confront it once more. When morning finally arrived, I returned to my daily tasks with a lingering dread in my heart. I couldn't explain the voice or the image I'd seen, and I resolved never to approach that corner again. Yet every time I worked in that space, I could not shake the feeling that something had changed. Later that morning, I told my brother what had happened. He listened quietly, nodding. "Maybe the building is just settling," he suggested. But I knew it was more than that. A tone in the voice and the chill in the air did not belong to simple old wood. I spent the rest of the day at my tasks, yet my mind kept returning to that narrow corridor and the figure at its end. Every time I passed that spot, I hesitated, half expecting to hear that quiet plea again. As dusk fell, I found myself drawn back to the barn, not to work, but to face my own curiosity and prove that I'm not mental. I circled the building, examining every door and corner. The narrow door remained closed, its metal handle cold to my touch, as though warning me to stay away. I felt a mix of regret and longing for answers, but fear kept me from pushing further. I left the barn that night with more questions than I had when I entered. Days turned into weeks, and life on the farm slowly regained its routine. Yet I often caught myself stealing a glance at the door, expecting the call to begin again. I never learned exactly what I had seen that night. The experience remained an unsolved mystery, a quiet echo in a place I once thought I knew well. And sometimes, late at night, I feel a chill when I recall the rush of cold air behind that door and the fleeting form that reached out. I continue my work on the farm, determined not to let fear govern me. Still, I know that every creak of the wood and every soft rustle might be a reminder that some places hold secrets beyond explanation. The barn keeps its secret, and I carry the unanswered plea with me, a call that both warns and haunts me long after the night has passed. I had spent many evenings working in the cornfield. Most nights, the work went on without incident. I would finish my shift, pack up my tools, and head home under the open sky. That night, the field was quiet. I was closing up when I first heard a scraping sound that did not match the usual creaks of the farm. I stopped for a moment, listening. The sound came from deeper in the rows, somewhere I had never seen anyone work at that hour. I kept working for a few minutes, trying to convince myself it was the wind playing tricks on me. But then I saw a shape behind a row of corn. A man crouched low between the stalks. At first, I thought he might be lost or simply taking a break. I stepped closer, cautious but curious, and called out, "Hey, what are you doing here?" There was no answer. Instead, the man slowly stood up. I noticed that his eyes held a hard, cold look. He did not speak. He only stared at me. I took a step back, my heart beginning to beat faster. I told myself that perhaps he was simply upset to be found on my property, and I planned to ask him for an explanation. But then he took a step forward. The sound of his boots on the hard dirt made it clear he was moving intentionally. I caught a glimpse of a knife glinting in his hand. The sight made my blood run cold. My mind raced. This was not a lost drifter or a frightened soul. This man meant harm. I raised my voice. "Stay where you are. What do you want?" He did not reply. Instead, he advanced, his pace quickening as he began moving between the rows toward me. I realized that his intent was not just to surprise me, it was to hurt me. I turned and started to run, my boots pounding against the ground as I fled the rows I had worked in for years. The corn pressed close on either side as I ran, and I could hear his heavy steps behind me. I did not dare look back too often, but the sound of his approach was relentless. I steered in the direction of the farmhouse, knowing it was my only chance for safety. Every step felt like an eternity as fear drove me forward. When I reached the edge of the field, I burst through a gap that led to a small dirt road. I could still hear the man's footsteps, closer now. My breath came in short gasps, and I felt a mix of anger and terror. I had never before been in a situation like this on my own land. The man behind me had shown no sign of slowing, and his presence felt like a threat that would not be ignored. I reached the farmhouse door and pounded on it, my voice hoarse as I shouted for help. After a few long moments, a light appeared in the window, and the door opened. A neighbor, startled by my frantic knock, ushered me inside quickly. I nearly collapsed on the wooden floor as I tried to catch my breath, still hearing the sound of running footsteps behind me. The neighbor's eyes widened as I stammered out my account. A man in the field, a knife, and an attack that had forced me to run for my life. He grabbed his phone and called the police. I sat by the door, listening as the conversation took place. Outside, the night remained unnervingly quiet. There was no sound of someone crashing through the corn or breaking branches as he came closer. I waited in a mixture of shock and anger, replaying the events in my head and wondering how a stranger could appear in my field with such intent. When the police arrived, I told them everything I remembered. They searched the area, looking through the rows and along the road, but found no trace of the man. They noted the marks on my arms from where I had brushed past corn stalks, and the scratch on my cheek where I had grabbed something, a detail that chilled me further. One of the officers looked at me with a seriousness that confirmed my fears. This was not an isolated act of vandalism or trespassing. Someone had tried to murder me. I was taken to the local station to give a full statement. The officers asked questions in a firm, direct manner. I explained that the man's eyes held a hostile look and that he had come at me without a word, his intention clear in his grip on the knife. They took my statement, promising that they would increase patrols in the area and check the surrounding roads. Yet I could tell from the way they talked that such incidents were rare in our small farming community. There was a sense that nothing like this should happen here. After the report was filed, I returned to the farm, still shaken. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting the attacker to reappear. Each time I worked the fields, I kept a wary eye on the corn's edges. The peaceful routine I had known was replaced by a constant alertness. I began locking up earlier and checking the perimeters of the property before finishing my work. Over the next few days, I talked to several neighbors. Some said they had noticed a man on the road or seen someone lurking near the field late at night, but no one had been as direct or as violent as the figure I encountered. I learned that there had been a few recent reports of a man known to roam rural areas, a drifter with a history of violent behavior. The possibility that the attacker was a known criminal made my heart sink. I wondered how he had gotten so close to my property without being noticed. The police eventually told me they were following up on other reports in the area, but nothing concrete turned up. They advised me to be cautious and to report any new sightings immediately. Every evening, I walked around the edges of the field, scanning the area for any sign of movement. Each rustle in the corn made my pulse race. I no longer felt safe in a place that had once been a refuge. One night, about a week after the attack, I was working late in the field again, gathering what I could before a storm was expected. The dark sky and the steady wind through the rows did little to calm my nerves. I kept an eye out for anything unusual, every noise a potential threat. I thought about the man, how quickly he had come at me, how his eyes burned with anger. The memory of that night was enough to make my hands shake. I could not shake the thought that he might return. I doubled my efforts to secure the property. I informed my supervisor and even set up a couple of extra lights along the perimeter. Despite these precautions, I could not rid myself of the image of that aggressive face, the glint of the knife, and the sound of his pursuit echoing in my ears. Over time, the immediate threat seemed to fade into a background fear, a part of my everyday worry that never fully left me. I still work in that field every day, and I still feel a chill when I see someone moving near the corn. I have not seen the man again, and the police have not come forward with any new leads. But I remain alert, unable to forget the night when a stranger with murderous intent shattered the quiet routine of my work. I have come to accept that in a place where nothing much ever happens, one violent night can change everything. I share my story now with a quiet tone and a steady gaze. I know that some will doubt me, that they might say I imagine the details in my fear. But I remember every step, every heartbeat, and every sound as if it were yesterday. I know the truth of that night, and it is a truth that has left me with scars I cannot show, but can feel every time I step into the field. The routine is back, but the memory remains. I check the rows twice as I walk, and I make sure the doors are locked. I continue my work, knowing that the field is not just rows of corn, but also the stage for an encounter that changed my life. The image of that man and the sound of his approach stay with me. A reminder that danger can come when least expected, and that sometimes the face of aggression hides in plain sight. Harvest season is a time I have always known well. Every year I walk among the rows of wheat and watch the crops ripen after months of care. This autumn began like any other, with the promise of a good yield and the familiar routine of work. I rose early, laced up my worn boots, and stepped out into a cool morning. The fields stretched out before me in neat rows, a testament to our hard work. As I began gathering the ripened stalks, I sensed a change in the air. The day was crisp, and the light held a calm tone, yet there was an undercurrent of something I could not name. I worked among the rows, harvesting with care, but my mind kept drifting to the feeling that something was off, as if the land itself were holding its breath. It wasn't long before I encountered the source of that unease. In a corner of the field where I rarely worked, I came upon a scarecrow I had never seen before. It stood apart from the others, its form haphazard and its clothing worn and mismatched. The face was constructed of burlap and old fabric, lacking the simple design of our usual scarecrows. Instead, its appearance carried an odd weight, as if burdened by a secret I could not explain. I approached the scarecrow slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached out to touch the fabric of its coat, the contact sent a chill through me. I had expected only the rough texture of burlap, yet I felt a strange resonance, a wordless plea that seemed to come from the very cloth. Startled, I quickly pulled my hand away, my heart thumping not from fear, but from an inexplicable discomfort. For a long moment I stood there, studying the figure. I searched its featureless face for answers, but found nothing. It was as if the scarecrow had been placed there not by a human hand, but by some unknown force. A part of me wanted to understand, while another part urged me to leave it be. I walked away, trying to dismiss the encounter, yet its memory clung to me throughout the day. I returned to my work, attempting to focus on the harvest. Still, every time I glanced toward that corner, I wondered about the scarecrow. The rest of the day passed with the steady rhythm of routine, the rustle of wheat, the low hum of the wind, but my thoughts remained fixed on that odd figure. I could not chalk it up to a mere decoration. Something about its presence was out of place. As the afternoon wore on, the light dimmed and the air turned cooler. I finished my work with a lingering sense of discomfort. When I finally sat for a break under a tree by the field, I recalled the scarecrow and the strange feeling it had stirred, an unease that felt as if the land were mourning something unsaid. That evening, on my way back to the farmhouse, I couldn't help but look back at the fields. There it was, standing in a lonely corner, as if waiting. I paused for a moment to watch it before continuing on my way. I resolved then to focus on my work and let the strange incident fade into the background of everyday life. But in the days that followed, the scarecrow's presence began to alter my routine. Each morning, as I headed to the field, I sensed a heaviness in the air. I worked the land, yet I could not ignore that the rows near the scarecrow seemed different. The wheat there, though as healthy as ever, carried an air of resignation, as if even the plants were affected by the presence of that figure. I often found myself stealing a glance in its direction, feeling an unspoken connection between the land and the unexpected marker in the field. I tried to reason it out. Perhaps it was only my imagination, a trick of the light in these cool autumn mornings. I told myself the scarecrow was nothing more than an extra, an oddity that would soon pass. But the feeling did not leave me. It was as if its arrival had opened a door to something I was not ready to face. One day, after finishing my morning harvest, I lingered by the scarecrow. I sat on a crate and studied it, not out of fear, but from a need to understand. I examined the fabric, the way it hung from the frame, and noted that nothing about it suggested recent repair or intentional placement. It simply was, standing in the field as if it had always belonged, though I knew that could not be true. I began asking around, speaking with neighbors and fellow farmhands to see if anyone else had noticed the new figure. Their responses were mixed. Some admitted they had seen it, while others claimed it was new to them as well. No one could offer an explanation. In the absence of any clear answer, I was left with a quiet puzzlement. In the weeks that followed, my work continued, yet the memory of the scarecrow never left me. Each day's harvest was marked by that lingering presence, a reminder that the land sometimes holds secrets that we overlook amid our busy routines. I started paying closer attention to small details, a slight change in the color of the wheat here, a different movement of the wind there, and I recorded these observations in a small notebook. The area near the scarecrow appeared to have its own pace, distinct from the rest of the field. Even as the harvest neared its end, I could not shake the feeling that the scarecrow had altered the land in some mysterious way. I spent long evenings on the porch, watching the fields as day faded into dusk. There it remained, a silent figure in a lonely corner, prompting a sense of loss, as if something important had passed through and left its mark. Now, as I write these words under a gray sky and look out over fields at rest, the scarecrow still stands in its place. I have come to accept that not all things in life have clear explanations. The scarecrow is one mystery among many, a small anomaly in a season defined by routine and hard work. I do not know who made it or why it appeared now, but it has become part of my experience, a quiet reminder that even in the most ordinary times, the unexpected finds a way in. I continue my work on the farm with the same steady pace as always, but I carry with me the memory of that encounter. The figure, with its worn fabric and uneven form, marks a time when the land itself seemed to speak of loss and hidden stories. It reminds me that a harvest is not only about reaping the bounty, but also about recognizing moments that defy easy explanation. And as I gaze out over the still fields, I know that the land holds its own stories, waiting quietly for someone to notice.